Noah DeCoyer, and I'm your co-host. Today our guest is Dr. David Seaman, the author of the DeFlame Diet. Deflame your diet, body, and mind. Dr. Seaman received a BS in biology and nutrition at Rutgers, then went to New York Chiropractic College. Shortly after graduating, 30 years ago now, he took classes that delved more deeply into pain mechanisms and realized that food-related chemicals cause inflammation and stimulate pain fibers, nociceptors. Dr. Seaman has written 2 books and many articles and book chapters on the topic of nutrition for pain and inflammation. He has taught this topic in several chiropractic college programs, including Palmer, National, and Logan. His most recent book is The DeFlame Diet, which was published in April of 2016. Thank you, Dr. Seaman, for your time today. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Listen, Dr. Seaman, you've been talking about inflammation and deflaming for years. The first time I realized it, and it's a magazine cover that we use all the time in our lectures, was the February 23rd, 2004 Time magazine cover, and the headline was Inflammation, the Silent Killer. Thoughts on this?
Yeah, that really kind of captured the issue, but then when they get into it, in that book, or rather in that article, and in lots of other articles, they'll typically skirt around the real big hairy elephant gorilla in the middle of the room, and that is overeating sugar, flour, and the refined oils that sugar and flour are cooked in. And they get on to this, like, take fish oil, which is fine, do this, do that, but it's kind of any of those therapies are less effective if you're flaming away with, by eating too many donuts and donut-like foods. But other than that, though, they were right on the money. And what people really should have taken from that is that Alzheimer's disease is basically atherosclerosis of the brain. Diabetes is Alzheimer's disease of the pancreas. Osteoarthritis is atherosclerosis of joints, and we can kind of go on and on because the chemistry of all these diseases are essentially identical, the difference being the parenchymal or structural tissues that the diseases occur in. So that's really the difference. So it can kind of like confuse what one should do for one disease versus the other because the names are different and the tissues are different in terms of anatomy, but the biochemistry is virtually identical in all of those conditions.
Yeah, we're going to dive into that in 1 second, but just to set the stage and just for our audience to get a feel of who you are, how did you get into this topic? Because you're trained as a chiropractor, and first all chiropractors start off being trained in, structure equals function, and then, we branch off into different topics and different specialties. How did you end up here and where you are today?
Well, my undergraduate degree was in biology/nutrition, and I went through all the chemistry stuff, biochemical pathways and Krebs cycle and glycolysis numerous times, memorizing from glucose down to ATP numerous times, and how lipids got into the Krebs cycle, making ATP numerous times. And when I was in college, the biochem book that I used showed that there were nutrients that were required to drive these pathways. And then when I got into chiropractic college, I became a fan of trigger point therapy, and my favorite book, and it's still a favorite of mine in terms of historical significance for me, was Janet Travell and David Simon's book on trigger points. And they have a perpetuation chapter, and that perpetuation chapter, half of it is about nutrition. And so I started, look at this, nutrition and muscle pain. So that kind of intrigued me when I was in chiropractic college. And then shortly after graduating, I took a postgrad class that was taught by a fairly famous, deceased now, British medical doctor whose career was basically looking at joint pain, joint neurology, articular neurology. And he was a friend to physical therapists, manual therapists of all kinds, be they physiotherapists, massage therapists, historical bone setters, or chiropractors. And his name is Dr. Barry Wyke, W-Y-K-E, not to be confused with Barry White, the Ally McBeal singer dude. So I took this class with him, like, I don't know, maybe a year after I graduated. So that's like almost 30 years ago. And he went over the pain system in a fashion where I could actually sit back and not have to worry about a test or the next hour going to a different class or whatever it might be. I sat there for 12 or 15 hours, and he basically made it very, very clear that our body chemistry is perhaps the most profound influencer of our pain system's activity and its stimulation. And that really kind of got me going. And I started to look at nutrition from the perspective of its ability to produce the chemicals that Dr. White laid out. And that was back in like 1987 or so. So I've been doing this and hunting for information for 30 years now. So when I read that article in Time Magazine and some of the other books that came out about inflammation and diet, I'm like, geez, I should have got this book out earlier. I mean, I was teaching postgrad classes to chiros on this topic in 1992. And I didn't get my book out until 2016. I'm a little bit late to the show, even though I was there in the beginning.
Better late than never. So
that's true.
Let's go there. How about starting this conversation with the difference between acute inflammation versus chronic inflammation? Because they both have their importances, but I don't know if everybody really understands the difference between both of those types.
Well, when you take a biology class or a physiology class, the topic of inflammation is discussed, and it's always described in the context of a post-injury chemical response that involves swelling, redness, heat, and pain, and that response is required for healing to occur, and that's all absolutely true. The problem is when inflammation is quiet, and it's typically called the term chronic is usually used for the quiet version, where there is no swelling, there is no redness, there is no heat, there's no identifiable presence of inflammation. And that is what takes place within vessel walls for heart disease and in the pancreas for type 2 diabetes, and even in tendons for tendinopathy and joints for osteoarthritis. It's a more silent, kind of quiet version until enough tissue has been damaged so as to bring out symptoms. And the symptoms are typically brought out in a fashion that does not alert us to the previous 10, 20, 30 years of self-abuse in a moderate fashion, as we call it. Well, I only smoke a little bit. I only eat a couple of donuts a day. I haven't exercised in 5 years, but I walk a little bit. All those things are pro-inflammatory. Over time, they manifest in this chronic state that then is associated with chronic disease expression. So one is quiet and silent until it expresses itself, and the other is robust and obvious after a typical injury. And the chronic version is the one associated with diet, even though, interestingly, if you eat a donut, your body will undergo an acute response, an inflammatory response to the food, but it will be silent to your symptoms. So it's really kind of a paradoxical situation.
Interesting. And before we really dive into diet, how does inflammation, because I know this is where you really studied, particularly in your early years, how does inflammation relate to pain?
Well, when you think about the neurology of pain, and most practitioners, and this involves whether it would be a chiropractor, a medical doctor, osteopath, physical therapist, it really doesn't make any difference. We all learn basic pain mechanisms from a physiology book. And physiology books, they don't really get into the detail of how these pain fibers, or properly called nociceptors, are stimulated. So the way it works is, for example, prostaglandins are probably one of the better known inflammatory chemicals. And for the listening audience who says, I'm not sure what a prostaglandin is, people take aspirin, Tylenol, Aleve, Motrin, Celebrex. People take those medications to turn off the production of prostaglandins. Now, the way prostaglandins cause pain is they stimulate a specific prostaglandin receptor on the pain fiber. And so if we didn't have prostaglandin receptors, we wouldn't have pain from prostaglandins, but we'd have pain from other chemicals. Now, the problem with prostaglandins is that their balance of production in the body is dependent on the types of fats that we eat. And this is where people, have an urge to consume fish oil, for example, because fish oil is anti-inflammatory, and one of the beneficial effects of fish oil is the reduction of this pro-inflammatory, pain-stimulating prostaglandin, and instead a greater production of an anti-inflammatory, non-pain stimulating prostaglandin.
Gotcha. Perfect. So that's a perfect segue into food. What are some examples of how diet can promote inflammation, or that chronic or that silent inflammation in your body?
Well, let's just say that somebody decides that they're going to avoid eating vegetables and eat sugar, flour, refined oils, and then, well, I mean, let's look at, I guess another way to look at it would be, what does the average American eat? About maybe 10% of their calories comes from vegetables, fruit, nuts, and beans. And whole grains are the least healthy of your whole foods. The lion's share of calories in the average American's diet comes from sugar, flour, and refined oils, and about 10% from milk, and maybe 15-20% from meat. So the average person just eats basically meat and bread and pasta and sugar, flour desserts and donuts and those types of things. So when we eat those foods, there is an immediate inflammatory reaction that occurs. When you're young, you don't feel anything. And when you're young and when you're busy running around, you don't get any weight gain. And then when people continue to eat that way in college, and now in college they're sitting a lot more because they're in class, and then they study, and then at night they're studying, they're eating, and so they're spending a lot more time being sedentary, eating the same amount of calories from the same foods. They start to put on body fat. And the accumulation of body fat from those calorie sources is the easiest way to identify that one is flaming up, as I call it. So body fat gain is a manifestation of low-grade inflammation developing. So that is one example. And the average person in America, well, if 1 out of 3 Americans is normal weight, and 2 out of 3 are either overweight or obese, which means that 2/3 of the adult population, and now kids, of course, are heavy too. So 2/3 of the adult population are inflamed from the perspective of body weight. Now, when they're eating these calorie sources, and I call them calorie sources rather than food, because sugar, flour, and refined oils, that's not food. Food is stuff that is living either on the ground, running around in the woods, or grazing, or is growing in the ground, or swimming in the ocean. That's food. Sugar and flour, not growing, not food. Right. So when we eat these calorie sources, there is the bacteria in our intestines reacts to the sugar, flour, and refined oils to create a low-grade inflammatory reaction in the gut. And that low-grade inflammatory reaction in the gut is transferred due to the fact that the sugar, flour, as well as bacterial end products are absorbed into circulation, and so you get a low-grade inflammatory reaction every time we eat those foods. When we overeat those foods, we gain weight. And so when it goes on over time, the sugar and flour will drive the inflammation, and then eating too much omega-6 fatty acids from the refined oils, as in deep-fried food, that will change the anatomy of our cell membranes and make them pro-inflammatory, so that now our cells in our body, all the ones that are produced after we get into this overeating inflammatory food state, all the cells in our body then take on a molecular signature, a molecular anatomy of inflammation. And this goes on over time. And then eventually we start not to feel well, like, I don't like it. I'm a little fatigued, I'm achy, I'm tired, a little depressed. All of those symptoms, which are very common in young adults, is a manifestation of chronic inflammation. It's due to overeating sugar, flour, refined oils, and not eating vegetables, fruits, tubers like sweet potatoes, nuts, and legumes.
Dr. Seaman, at first glance, it's in your book, and at first glance, the percentage astounded me. You said 60% of the American diet is flour, sugar, and refined It seems kind of astounding, but then when you think about what the average person eats, an average person wakes up, has a cup of coffee with milk and sugar and a bagel. For lunch, they have a sandwich with some cheese and some cold cuts, and if for dinner they have pasta and garlic bread, right? Like that's the
There
average
you
meal.
go. And dessert. And
And
you eat that for a
dessert,
dessert in there, yeah.
right? And
And
that's a
soda.
little bit of and
And
soda.
don't
Oh,
forget
geez.
soda. And if you're in the South, you got sweet tea.
Uh-huh.
So the average American eats about 100 plus pounds of sugar a year.
Right. So at first glance, like I said, it looks a lot, but then you realize that it's not a lot. It's what everybody's doing. And then when you really look at all the biochemical processes, like you said, like your cell membranes literally becoming transformed because of this, you can understand why we're such an obese, sick, unhealthy nation, and getting sicker, by the way.
And to be fair, I also in the book I mentioned that is more about, I think about 56% or 55.6 or 57%, not 60% based upon one assessment. But I just rounded up to 60 because it's easier to remember. And because you and I aren't doing that, some guy out there is doing 70% or 80% to make up for us.
I know that's scary.
Yeah, it is scary.
Let's hit this. What foods inflame and which foods deflame?
Well, the chart of foods that deflame, people will see things like bacon and cream cheese and cream and heavy cream and think, how could that be? Well, you can't just drink heavy cream, but the point is if you're eating vegetables, those fatty foods are really irrelevant in the context of driving inflammation. People will think, well, meat is the bad thing, right? People will ask, probably you and certainly me, do you eat meat? Like as if meat is bad. The reason why is because when you look at a burger, you usually see it covered with dripping with cheese